Okay, welcome to MedChem Wednesday. How we doing? Feeling pretty good about this exam? I'll go out there and crush it. Cool. I hope so. I think you guys are gonna do great. Okay, so a few announcements to make before we get started. YouTube is fully updated, so you have the content from last class, as well as the content we covered in the review on Monday. We'll be holding another review today. It's gonna be held from noon to 2 in Biodesign C, room C201. A couple things that came up. Number one, I will record it this time. I'll also provide the Zoom link for everybody. Until I didn't realize I had my enzyme background on. I know it's pretty cool. You guys don't everyone tell me at the same time. But the other thing I was gonna say is for anyone that tried to get in the building, I hope this didn't happen to too many people. And you got sworn by security. They shouldn't do that. So just if that ends up being a problem, just email me. I'll be looking at my email on my phone just to make sure that's not a problem. I'll check it at least every 10 minutes or so to make sure that you guys can definitely get in. And I apologize about that happening. I didn't think that was gonna be a problem. I told them at the beginning if they're coming to a review session to let you guys in. Was that a problem for anybody in here? I'm trying to get a number on how many people this was a problem for. I got a couple emails. Okay, at least nobody in here. That's good. Anybody on Zoom? Is that a problem? Maybe. Okay. The other announcements I want to draw your attention. I sent you guys sort of a series of announcements this morning. The one I want to draw your attention to is that magic methyl effect paper. That's going to cover sort of a phenomenon in drug discovery now called the magic methyl effect. It's sort of to give you guys a little bit of a warm up for sort of looking at sort of literature, right, as it relates to medicinal chemistry. Don't read the whole paper, please. Only read the first 5 pages or so. Get a general feel for what the magic methyl effect is all about. I will ask you a very high level multiple choice question on that. It'll be worth 5 points. So if there's 200 points worth of time to think about on your exam, I would devote 5 points worth of time to that. Okay. You guys want to have any discussions with me during the review about the magic methyl effect? I can obviously talk about that, but I'll leave that up to you guys when we get in there. In the review session, I liked how it ran last time. We went through sort of all the notes, or I guess all the PowerPoint slides, and then we carried on sort of some general questions. We did some arrow pushing to give you sort of the abbreviated version of that 2-hour recording. So again, if you guys have any questions, bring them all during the review. I'll have mine today, and then Abesh will have his on Friday. I'll also try to pop into Abesh's a little bit just to see how things are going, and if anyone doesn't want to ask Abesh a question, you can ask me the question during that time. Cool. How many people are planning on coming to today's thing in person? Actually, that's a good question. I'm trying to prepare for chairs. Okay. We ran into a chair problem. Okay. Okay, cool. So what I'm going to do is we're going to go ahead and start to cover section 3. This is where we're going to get into sort of that the pharmacokinetics aspects to drug discovery. This is where, in my opinion, it gets real fun. I think you guys are really gonna enjoy it. So at least I hope. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and share screen. First, is there any general questions? I'll give you guys the final sort of like, here's what it's gonna look like when you walk in and everything on Friday. Okay, so navigating who's gonna be taking it online and who's going to be taking it in person. I can tell there's some preferences across the board. I've had some conversations with some of you. I don't care which way you take it. Doesn't matter to me. But what I will say is, if you're going to take it over Zoom, you are under sort of the, the time frames in which I assign. In other words, that half an hour time frame that you have to get it to me is a very cut and dry half an hour, not 45 minutes, for example. Okay. All right. So let me open up section 3. Everyone can access section 3 on the modules. Nice. Yeah, so as I sort of alluded to, we're going to get into now section 3. So you guys sort of have the general, I would say the general basics of what medicinal chemistry looks like, and sort of a discussion of sort of the drug targets that we're going to go after, sort of general considerations about sort of what to consider in drug design. But now we sort of get into the part of the course where we really start to think about the considerations as you start to develop a drug, right? So you have that really great compound that you think is going to cure whatever it is you're after, but we have to consider sort of its pharmacokinetics, and we're going to talk about that heavily today, right? So this is a pretty good generic picture of sort of the considerations we're going to be talking about, and we're going to go sort of all the way through that. And so, the way sort of to think about this is, if you think about sort of there being 3 phases of drug action, we start sort of at it would be fitting, right, that you would start with the pharmaceutical phase, right? The way that you're going to dose it, the way you're going to give it to a patient, for example. And then you have to consider, right, the pharmacokinetic phase, such that that's where that ADME is going to come up. We're going to discuss that in a slide or two. Absorption, distribution, metabolism, excretion of the compound. And then finally, the pharmacodynamic phase, where we discuss sort of the drug receptor interaction. And so we're going to do things just a little bit out of order, because you almost need the primer in the middle section. That'd be phase 2, pharmacokinetic phase, to get a feel for the significance of the first and the third phase. So we'll be talking about that in a little more detail as we move along. So these are the 4 that we're going to spend a lot of time on. I think this is going to be maybe a good, I would say almost like third of the course in consideration. And so, so ADME, just to lay it out for you, right? A, right, is going to be the absorption, the process by which the drug enters your body. The D is going to be distribution, movement of the drug between various compartments in the body. M, which is going to be one major discussion, is the metabolism. So the mechanisms by which the drug is structurally altered into another chemical entity, right? And that's for many different purposes, whether it's to actually turn on the active drug, or if it's to get rid of the drug after it's done what it's supposed to do in the body. So as sort of a signaling to get rid of it or excrete it. Elimination would be the sort of the final component of that. So that's clearance of the drug and its metabolites from the body. So keep in mind, right, throughout this discussion, we're going to be discussing not only, the drug, but also sort of the several metabolites that may come about from taking the drug. This is sort of just to give you sort of a generic view of sort of the different sort of locations, right, to consider as you consider sort of the journey of, let's say, an orally active drug, right? And a lot of that starts with sort of the buccal cavity, right? So that's your mouth, right? And you have, of course, goes down the esophagus, and then sort of one of the main points that we're going to make is sort of what happens now in the stomach, right? That ends up being the key location where everything gets broken down, right? It's I would say relative acidity in comparison to other locations of the body. It's acidic, right? So there's sort of many different things to get thinking about, and they're sort of mapped out here. I would take a minute to read sort of this slide in a little more detail as sort of a heads up as the things that we'll be considering. Now, once it moves sort of through the stomach, right, then you have that's where sort of the intestine absorption, right, things start to come into play. And so we're going to talk a lot about sort of ionized versus unionized drugs, sort of once they've passed the stomach, and how those are able to actually be absorbed into, for example, right, the portal vein seen on the left, through the liver, right, to get rid of toxins, for example. So a lot of this ends up coming into a more detailed discussion when we get into sort of case studies, but we'll cover it in sort of a new level of depth right now before we get into that. So drug absorption, a few key notes heading in. Got a couple slides of that. Efficient drug absorption in the GI tract requires a drug to have the correct balance of water versus fat solubility. You guys probably have a pretty good appreciation for that at this point. All right, you can imagine, right, two polar causes an inability to pass through the cell membrane. And on the flip side, right, two nonpolar causes poor solubility in the gut and will dissolve in fat globules. And so we'll talk about those fat globules a little later. Why are the amines so popular in drug scaffolds, right? If you look at, say, the top 200 drugs, there's an individual in the, I'll send it out to you, in University of Arizona, that actually publishes like the top 200 drugs, each year. And I would say probably a good 85% of them are amine containing drugs. And the reason for that is that they're able to not only provide sort of favorable binding interactions for targets, but they're also tunable as they go throughout the body. So it's easy to sort of facilitate their movement, right, from one location to another. And the way that happens, right, is that they function as weak bases. So they have a pKa somewhere between 6 and 8, and they enable a partial ionization at slightly acidic or alkaline pHs. And so that ends up being a key aspect, especially in those sort of absorption processes that we'll talk about in the intestine. And so this is a pretty good example right here in figure 11.1 from the Patrick book, right? You have the ionized amine. It can form sort of a good receptor interaction and water solubility, right? Because it's ionized, right? Sort of functions almost as, you're almost thinking of it as sort of like sodium chloride, for example, salt, right? It's able to ionize well and then be dissolved in water. And then the non-ionized amine is a bit more hydrophobic rather. And so it's able to cross membranes much easier than, let's say, the ionized form would. So how do we determine the extent of ionization? That's, of course, the Henderson-Hasselbalch equation. You guys learned about that extensively, probably in previous courses. Once again, I'm not going to have you do math throughout this course, but it's just sort of a gentle reminder as to how we get thinking about that. Some general rules that are obeyed when we initially sort of look at a possible compound for drug usage. How many of you guys have heard of Lipinski's Rules of 5? Is this something that's ever come up? Okay, these are pretty cool, and these have served as, like, the go-to guidelines for quite some time as to whether or not even a drug is considered, even to head into trials or sort of related type of situations, right? So the general rules that are obeyed are that it would possess less than 5 or equal to 5 hydrogen bond donors expressed as hydroxyl groups or amines. So remember, right, in that case, right, an NH and NH2, right, would function as actually 2 hydrogen bond donors. Something to think about. The second one is that it would be less than or equal to 500 Daltons in molecular weight. That's the same as grams per mole. It would have a log P of less than or equal to 5. And we'll talk about log P in the next slide. It's a sort of a balance of hydrophobicity and hydrophilicity. And then H bond acceptors This is less than 10. It used to be less than 5, which is why it sort of falls under the 5 category. But once again, that's expressed then as sort of your nitrogens and oxygens. And so if it meets all those criteria, it immediately sort of ends up in the running as sort of a good drug for sort of in vivo applications. Just to touch base, you guys are not going to have to know this on an exam or anything, but just to give you a feel for how you're thinking about determining a log P value. So how hydrophobic or how hydrophilic something is they'll actually take, if you guys remember from organic chemistry lab, right, they'll take a separatory funnel and they'll use, they'll add water and N-octanol. And what they'll ultimately do is they'll assess how much of the drug, or they'll add the drug, they'll assess how much of the drug is in the octanol versus the water layer. And that gives them sort of a good feel for how hydrophobic or how hydrophilic the drug is. Super cool. If you guys want to read about it, there's a nice sort of overview of it in this link here. More recently, I would say that sort of on top of the Lipinski's rules of 5, there's also been sort of the Weber rules that have also come up. So one of the main hangups with the Lipinski's rules of 5 is that it doesn't take into account molecular flexibility. And so through some of our earlier discussions, right, it would make sense that you'd want to get thinking about that, right? So for example, we talked about sort of the substituents on a drug, right? If they're constantly pointed this way, right, and they need to be pointed this way, you're going to want that sort of flexibility and sort of the drug being able to bind to the target. And so Weber's rules mentioned that you should have less than or equal to 10 rotatable bonds, and that sort of helps put it in a molecular flexibility threshold that's not too flexible, because again, you don't want it to be too flexible, right? Because just from if you guys always rely on sterics to think about things, right, you're gonna want to sort of minimize your steric interactions, right? So you want some rigidity in the molecule. The second one is less than or equal to 140 in PSA, so polar surface area. That's a little harder to calculate. That's really looking at how much polar area. So how much, let's say, an oxygen, a nitrogen, sulfur takes up sort of in the polar space and sort of 3D space. There's some tougher calculations affiliated with that, and I'm gonna spare you of that. But nevertheless, sort of a cool sort of a 3D consideration in drug development. And the third is less than or equal to 12 total hydrogen bonds. That's acceptors plus donors. So that's pretty reasonable. And I would say that in both this one as well as in Lipinski's rules, they now sort of agree on that. That's actually been pretty good. It's actually pretty difficult to have a drug that meets the criteria of both Lipinski's rules and Weber's rules. I would say traditionally, people still rely heavily on Lipinski's rules. But actually, when we bring in medicinal chemists a little later in the semester, that's always a popular question. You rely heavily on Lipinski's or Weber's rules, and they might say both. That's usually what we get. Other couple key notes: on occasion, polar drugs with high molecular weight can cross the cell of the gut wall without passing through cell membranes in a process called penocytosis. So typically, right, sort of what initiates this is you'll have a certain event that an electrostatic type of interaction forms favorably with sort of the surface of the membrane, and then it'll actually signal the membrane to actually bring that molecule in. And so sometimes drugs,
They wrote it.
What?
I
the
know,
drug is
thank you.
deliberately
So what did you
designed
do?
to be highly
One
polar
by mine.
to protect against inhibition by the
They don't
manufacturer,
always do that shit.
to ensure
There's
the drug reaches the target location in high concentration. We'll talk a little bit about that
Probably
a
specific
little
first.
later on, especially in the
That's what I'm thinking.
case studies. Yeah, so getting into sort of drug distribution, a drug is typically very rapidly absorbed. a couple, actually after this. So once in the blood supply, it's evenly distributed throughout the body. So 20 billion capillaries with a total surface area of 200 square meters. Right. So I mean, think about that. When you're thinking about that, actually, that statement alone would make me never want to design a drug. Right? If you think about that, it's made it everywhere, like almost immediately through absorption, which I think is pretty cool, and distribution, I should say. So drugs do not have to cross cell membranes, right, in order to leave the blood system and are rapidly distributed into the aqueous fluid, right, surrounding tissues and organs, right? So this should, be a really good example of, how complicated this process might be. Once the drug has reached the tissues, it can immediately be effective if its target site is a receptor or it's hydrophobic enough to pass through the cell membrane. That's something that you should be able to appreciate by now, I would say. Concentration levels of drugs circulating in the blood supply rapidly fall after administration. Hydrophobic drugs are absorbed into fatty tissues and removed from the blood supply. Ionized drugs may be bound to various macromolecules and removed from blood supply. Something else to keep in mind, right? Every time you introduce something that's foreign, right, to your body, someone wants to remove it, right? So even if you're taking it for a headache and this thing is definitely going to help you with a headache, your body's still like, no go, right? So it's gonna immediately want to remove it, and it's going to do that in several different ways, and we'll talk about that as we move along. A couple important barriers to talk about, and I'm actually thinking about having this be sort of a more in-depth conversation later on in the course. Never really opened this up before, but it'd be a really fun one to explore with you guys. Would be the blood-brain barrier. So blood capillaries feeding the brain are lined with tight fitting cells, right, that don't contain pores and are coated with a fatty layer formed from nearby cells, right? That's great news and bad news for us, right? Great news, and that it's going to be really difficult for things to pass the blood-brain barrier. Bad news if we want to design drugs to get to the locations it needs to. And so it requires drugs to dissolve through the cell membrane and through the fatty cell coating. That's really challenging. We'll talk about that a little later. Hydrophilic drugs do not typically make it across either. So this is some really in-depth design for drugs in that space. Placental barrier, a little bit different, right? So it separates mother's blood from the blood of the fetus, right? The mother's blood provides the fetus with the essential nutrients and carries away waste products, but they must pass through this barrier, right? Fat-soluble drugs cross most easily, for sure. And so I mentioned sort of this placenta on a chip. So I think this is some fascinating research. I would say it crossed the entire sort of medchem realm of research. I would say that the placenta on a chip has been one of the most monumental sort of discoveries, tools that have been used across the board. And so, the idea there is that they can take sort of just on a small chip, it sort of mimics the placenta. They're able to just send sort of streams of drugs over the chip, and they actually have a readout that sort of indicates which ones will cross and which ones won't. And then they can also find sort of doses that are safe, right, for the mother to take, when pregnant, right? So really fascinating area of research. I would love to loop back around to this later on in the course, and I think we're gonna have the opportunity to do that. Right. So before we get into sort of the drug metabolism discussion, let's define a metabolite. And that's a compound resulting from the breakdown of a drug in the body. It must account, you absolutely have to account for these, right, in drug design, as we talked about several times. The body treats drugs as foreign substances. You can get rid of chemical invaders. I mentioned a couple slides ago. Polar invaders are taken care of by the kidney, and the hydrophobic compounds need to go through modifications to make them suitable for disposal. So it's a critical aspect in this sort of the design of drugs. And so phase one, we're going to talk about this sort of in two different phases. So phase one are going to be transformations that are sort of redox processes. So they're ones that usually involve oxidation, reduction, or hydrolysis to make the molecule more polar. As it gets more polar, it's going to be more suitable for for phase 2 transformations, which will involve conjugation reactions where the polar group is usually attached to a suitable, more polar handle and increase the excretion rate. So in order to get rid of a compound, right, usually it goes through a few processes that are going to make it much more polar and sort of acts as sort of a signal to get rid of it. So phase 1 transformations, to get into those, you're going to hear P450 all the time from now on, and you're never going to get sick of that, I'm sure. Easily the most important of the metabolic enzymes, big time liver. They are hemoproteins. They contain heme and iron. They split molecular oxygen, such that oxygen, the oxygen atom is introduced to the drug, and the other ends up in water, right? So it takes O2, gives one of the oxygens to the drug, and the other oxygen goes just to water. That's depicted in figure 11.3. Not particularly important for you guys to memorize that or anything. More general class is referred to as the monooxygenases. They introduce one oxygen per cycle. And there's at least 33 different CYPs. So CYP is short for cytochrome P450. There's 4 families and numerous subfamilies, right? So these have been big time targets in drug discovery as well. Isozyme, you're going to hear a lot about CYP 3A4, and that's responsible for the metabolism of almost most drugs. So I would say almost nearly every drug probably comes in contact with that before leaving the body. Phase 1 transformations, getting into this a little bit, usually happen, I would say the oxidation events usually happen at what I would consider to be an activated site. And so those activated sites are usually ones they trend with. If you were to, let's say, remove, first, actually, all of these are going to get replaced. It's going to replace a CH bond with a COH bond. Okay, and so the activated sites are ones such that if you were to remove the hydrogen atom and you would put and create a carbocation there, then it would have stabilization through resonance, right? So, for example, if you have one that's directly, if you form a carbocation that's right next to a nitrogen, right, that nitrogen can donate its lone pair to that empty p orbital. And we'll talk about that in a little more detail especially as you guys get towards studying for exam 2. I know you have exam 1 coming first. So some common locations for oxidation. Some of the target areas are going to be in what we'll refer to as activated positions. So one of the things it's really good at is actually going after CH bonds. So usually methyl or penultimate sites, so ones that are right next to the end group, are usually ones that are targeted first. So it could take a methyl, for example, to the corresponding sort of alcohol, and then you can oxidize it one more time and take it to the aldehyde. It'll take it again to the carboxylic acid. So it can take it all the way to the carboxylic acid. And as it does that, right, you get more polar, right, by becoming the alcohol versus the CH3. You then become, I would say, average, I would say polarity, right, and becoming the aldehyde, but then it gets really polar, right, when you get to the carboxylic acid, right. It'll do this sort of on a little bit longer chains, as you can see here. So these oxidations of the terminal methyl groups here. Oxidation of these penultimate groups are very common as well. So it's seen here. So instead of getting to the carboxylic acid, if it oxidizes it all the way, it'll get to the ketone, right? Because there's not another oxidation event to get it to carboxylic acid. Yeah, right. So there's also a steric component to it. It's gonna not only find the most activated position, but it's also going to find the place in which is least sterically hindered, right? So in this case, if you have an R group on this on the cyclohexane, what you're going to have is ultimately an oxidation sort of furthest away from that R group, where you can imagine the enzyme's got to latch onto it, right? And so it's going to leave. It's going to try and not run into that R group. Yeah, so this is where that sort of activated component, becomes a little bit more apparent. I recognize in this last slide, these are ones that sort of note, but sort of the more rational ones sort of come in this slide, where if you were to generate a carbocation, right, on CH3, so it's CH2 carbocation, these electrons from the aromatic come and satisfy that positive charge, right? So these are sort of more activated positions. And so yeah, so phenyl groups are great ones. So these like benzyl, this would be sort of considered a benzyl position here. Can be oxidized all the way up to the carboxylic acid, very similar to the last slide. Ketones also can be oxidized as well. Alkenes, so these ones that are allylic, these allylic sites can also be oxidized. And that's also sort of very similar, right, when you change it over to an alkyne, for example. And sort of the last one, I think, is another right example of the aromatic one, very similar to the top one. Yeah, right. So one of the things that becomes just, this is sort of the minor arrow pushing, right, that you have to do throughout the course, right? When you oxidize for, let's say, a methyl group on, let's say if you have like a nitrogen, carbon, oxygen, that you got that oxygen from the oxidation, right? That O carbon nitrogen it's not a stable entity, right? So that will fall off. So as formaldehyde, it'll give the minus charge to the nitrogen. We'll see a couple examples of this as we go along, but these are really primed spots, right, for oxidation. These are more activated positions as well. So ones that sit right next to a nitrogen, very activated. Ones that sit next to oxygens and sulfur, also very activated. Another activated position would be directly next to a halide. Now, okay, so now you have the situation where they can oxidize sort of in those activated positions, but it's also important to keep in mind that another key area for oxidation is going to be actually directly in the alkene. So you guys, I don't know, do you guys remember epoxide formation from sophomore organic? I hope so. Kind of, thinking a few like bobbled heads. Okay. Well, so ultimately, right, it's going to create these epoxides. And then, right, you fall in the situation, right, where that sort of primes it for a next step where water can come in via an epoxide hydrolase and form sort of these diols, right, making it more polar. So as you guys go through these, and we'll do this, you guys don't have to do it right now because you're preparing for exam 1, but you guys are going to eventually want to have a sort of a working sheet of different enzymes that your compounds might run into and when they're going to come into play. So some of them are going to come into play sort of when you have an alkene, right, and that gets epoxidized, but then sort of keeping in mind that then it can run into an epoxide hydrolase, for example, and open up. Is going to be important. The arrow pushing for these things, I'll get into that in just a second, but sort of this is another good example, epoxide hydrolase, where you can see there's stereochemistry affiliated with that, right? So that epoxide hydrolase is going to deliver a water molecule via an SN2, right? So you get inversion of stereochemistry at that site. There's a rearrangement that we're going to talk about in a slide or two. It's sort of a rearrangement hydride shift type of mechanism. It's called an NIH shift. We'll talk about that shortly. Then again, right, you have the epoxide hydrolase directly on an aromatic. Yeah, right. So here's sort of what the mechanism looks like for these oxidation events. I will not ask you this at all. So what it's going to look like on an exam is you're going to have R methyl. You're going to put an arrow and it's going to say P450, and then it's going to have RCH2OH. So you guys aren't going to have to run these. This happens via single electron mechanism, but you guys don't have to know that. This is sort of just as an FYI, and we'll talk about that as we move along. Possible fates of these arine oxides that we were talking about before, right? After you get epoxidation of the arine, you can go through sort of several different routes. And I should also mention this is where the Silverman book also can provide a nice supplement in sort of the conversations that are going on in the Patrick book. So I would suggest looking through those. I'm likely not going to. That one's a lot more organic heavy, so temper your usage of it. But I would say it does provide nice perspectives on a lot of these transformations. So it can go through. So these arine oxides can go through rearrangements. The NIH shift we'll talk about in a second. Go through epoxide hydrolase. That's usually like a phase 2 type of transformation. We'll get into that shortly. Glutathione S transferase. We'll discuss that in phase 2, but ultimately, right, it puts another group instead of attacking with water, it attacks with another more polar group to sort of help facilitate departure of the compound in the body. Or you also have macromolecular nucleophiles, right? So you guys have now an appreciation for the events that let's say the enzyme gets alkylated directly through those alkylation events. This is a very similar type of thing. It'd be like, for example, a serine maybe attacking. I use serine all the time, but you'd be, for example, a serine attacking the epoxide, and it would permanently bind to the enzyme. Simplified version of the NIH shift. Okay, so a long time ago, this is sort of the mechanistic studies that occurred. This is called an NIH shift because it was discovered at the National Institutes of Health, and they claim it. What happened, right, is that they formed, they found in metabolic studies, right, that they were generating these phenols, so phenyl with an OH on it, and that was happening directly via P450, via exposure to a P450. And so what they did is they did some deuterium labeling. This is sort of a way that we detect where hydrogens are going in organic chemistry in general. And so what they were finding is they're generating this arine oxide seen right here. And then what they proposed is, if you guys imagine, if you go back to your sophomore organic days, right? Some of the most stable carbocations are ones that are allylic carbocations. And so now you have what would be, this depiction right here is a doubly allylic carbocation. So they imagine that the epoxide can just open up. And then once it gets to here, this minus can come down and that deuterium can get shifted over. And that's been coined the NIH shift. And then ultimately, it goes through this process right here. Can anyone tell me what that is? What's that process called? It starts with a T. Bummer. I was hoping. It's tautomerization. I don't know if you guys remember that from back in the day. But man, I'm going to ask you about tautomerization many times in this course. In fact, so much. If you come out of this course and you don't know tautomerization, I'll be so upset. So let's get it down. Okay. So right. So then this happens also in the case of halogenated compounds, right? So in a very similar type of mechanism, right? You have the halogen. This is going to happen a whole bunch during the course. You're going to have a halogenated compound. It's going to go through epoxide formation. It's going to open up, and then it's going to perform an NIH shift of the halide. Then you're going to get to this intermediate down here, and then it's going to do what? That was my first test. Starts with a T. Tautomerization. That's what I'm talking about. I hope that's on the recording. It was a little quiet. Okay. NIH shift can happen for many different groups, right? So it can happen with halides. It can happen with nitro groups as well. But don't get duped by that on your exams, right? So this is the same exact thing, right? It forms the epoxide right here, and then now this is showing the epoxides opened up, and that nitro group just shifts, and then it goes through tautomerization. It's getting a little louder. Okay, I know it's We're in the middle of the week. Okay. So these are just sort of a couple other examples. This is sort of these in these carbamazepines. So we get a nice example of it happening actually in the context of a drug, right? You have P450 come in, forms the epoxide, and then that can go through an epoxide hydrolase transformation to get to the diol. Binding of the metabolite of aflatoxin B1 to DNA. That's a good example of sort of binding to a sort of macromolecular target, for example. And so you get to the epoxide at 8.35. And then a base, right, comes in and opens it up. And now it's sort of attached right directly to the DNA. Oxidations also can happen directly at heteroatoms. So nitrogens and sulfurs and phosphorus, I would say, are the three. It's not going to happen at oxygen. So you can see here, right, with tertiary amines, right, this is very similar, only it's just happening directly on the heteroatom. So it happens on tertiary amines, secondary amines. It really happens on most amines. Aliphatic primary amines sort of gives you the layout. Aromatic primary amines, right? See where it's all going. It also happens on pyridines, and sort of, right, this is another sort of tertiary type amine. Yeah, so this is sort of highlighting, right, it's happening on, it can happen on most amines. This is where I would say the arrow pushing becomes a little sort of important, and I would take some time to digest the ones that are in this slide in particular, right? So you could also have sort of demethylation type of processes where you get sort of, this is exactly what like a problem would look like, right? So you'd have, so your starting material, I guess we could start right here actually. And you would write literally P450 over this line. You would have it then hydroxylated. And since this unit, right, sits right next to a ketone, right? If you lose formaldehyde off of that, you can generate the enolate. You guys remember the enolate? Enols, enolates. Okay. You can generate the enolate, and then after protonation, you've ultimately removed a methyl group total. That's pretty sweet. I mean, it's not ideal if you don't want it to happen, but pretty cool. But then that can happen again, right? And so then you're left with 8.47, for example. This is a good example of this. This would be a great some great job. Get a whole bunch of points on your exam for this. Oxidative deamination, right? So we'll talk about, okay, this thing gets deaminated. How does that happen? And so this is exactly what it look like, right? So from P450 will come in. You'll generate, this would be an aminol, if you guys remember that. And then that would collapse, right, to get the ketone and the amine. Right, so you ultimately have now removed an amine, right? So I know you're a little focused on the arrow pushing right now, but I would also take a second and think sort of, that's really neat, right? The body has ways of getting rid of an amine if it doesn't need it. It's pretty cool. Right, in sort of a similar vein, right? This thing can go, so you can see, once you generate the aminol here, right, it can go to generate the ketone, right? What it can do instead, in this case, for example, is go the opposite way. It's generated the aminol, and now the amine has come down, helps facilitate the departure of OH, and you're ultimately left with the imine. So one thing I would say is really get familiar with, you really want to start getting familiar with the balances between, or I'd say the equilibrium between ketones, amines, and enamines. If those are things that you're unfamiliar with right now, you should start a discussion or something on the board to flag me on that. I'll be posting sort of an arrow pushing primer for you guys. It's going to be called module 3.5. I'll post that stuff for you. It's got a whole bunch of resources for arrow pushing. I think one thing that I would say, I'd caution you in looking at that is don't get too overwhelmed in like being able to push like these gigantic arrow pushing mechanisms. I give you guys sort of it's a PowerPoint that has sort of a list of key reactions that you're going to want to keep in mind. I could probably touch base on that next class actually, and then also some resources to look into if you're interested in sort of learning a little bit more on the arrow pushing side. It doesn't hurt. But just heading forward, right? There's a few more examples, and these ones are great, right? The last like several examples are great to go through for like now to get familiar with sort of what the arrow pushing looks like. Arrow pushing doesn't get too much more difficult after you have this stuff down. It's actually a lot of the same type of processes. And so you have this oxidative metabolism of propanol here. That's another really great example. And then you have N-oxidation of this pharmaceutical right here, right? And so that's sort of what we covered a couple slides ago, where you have NOH now. And that can go through an elimination to generate, you don't need to know what the name of this is, but it's a nitrone. That's not particularly important, but being able to do the arrow pushing mechanism would be good. If you're interested in looking at sort of the many, metabolism opportunities, right, for nicotine, feel free to take a peek at the slide after that. This is sort of just a really neat example. Yeah, right. So when we get into sort of the more reach type of arrow pushing, it's important to keep this in mind, right? So the metabolism is going to happen, right? You're going to get, let's say, a hydroxylation, for example, and then that might fall apart. The molecule might fall apart from there. But then after that, you might have to also search for metabolites that you didn't quite consider, right? So you would have imagined that you'd be looking for this metabolite if you got P450 oxidation here, right? And it gets to this intermediate. But then keep in mind, right, if that thing then forms the iminium ion, right, by departure of that OH, then you have the opportunity for closure of this ring, right? So this is a metabolite that they found in sort of the metabolism studies for lidocaine, for example. So those are things to also pay attention to. Mechanism, right? Very similar in terms of being able to oxidize heteroatoms. Very similar to what we saw before, but again, you're not going to have to push those arrows. Carbinoline, yeah, this one's also not particularly important, but it's there for your own purposes if you'd like to take a peek at it. I'm also happy to talk about these anytime. I think about these quite often. Metabolic activation of primary and secondary aromatic amines, right? This is another sort of unique opportunity, right, for a drug to get bound to a macromolecular target. We'll end in just a second. But ultimately what you have is sort of N-oxidation, and then usually something connected to that oxygen. And that allows for, if that becomes like a good leaving group, for example, then a macromolecular target can come in, attack here, and move the electrons up. And ultimately, you get to this intermediate in the bottom right. It's connected to the macromolecular target. And then it goes through a tautomerization. Good. And we'll end it right there. So that took us through most of phase one. Generally, what you're going to have to know. We'll talk a little bit about phase two next time. We'll talk a little bit about arrow pushing as well. It'll be a good way to end Friday. Thanks, guys.